he has spoken at a number of Fintellect events in the recent past. So let me also take this opportunity to thank Nick for his ongoing and enthusiastic support for Fintellect and Fintellect's partners. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. And let me now hand over the session to you.
Thank you, Shirish. Everyone, greetings from Hong Kong and Ramadan Kareem. I'm very honored to be able to join the Association of AML Compliance Officers of Banks in Bangladesh for today's sanctions training. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Razi Hassan for his introductory video and very kind words. I would also like to thank General Secretary Mamoun for helping to coordinate today's training, and especially Fintellect, including Shirish and Arpita, who have helped to organize and host today's session. As Shirish mentioned, I'm a lawyer in Hong Kong. I've been in the region for about 6 years. Prior to joining the legal profession, I was a sanctions compliance officer in Hong Kong for Citibank, where I provided advice and guidance to several business lines in the Asia Pacific region, which included 15 countries, including Bangladesh. So I'm going to try to bring both a legal perspective, but also a practical, hands-on perspective for the training today. I believe very strongly in sharing information and staying connected professionally. So I've tried to include as many web addresses as possible in the slides today so that you can find these resources on your own. If later on you have any questions or you need further information about the material in today's training, you only need to email me or connect on LinkedIn, and I would be happy to provide that information. So I'm going to structure today's training in 4 parts. And my goal today is to try to make U.S. economic sanctions as simple as possible. It's a complicated topic, it changes rapidly, but the good news is that there are some patterns which are very consistent, and I believe if you understand those patterns, you'll be able to handle most of the sanctions questions that you encounter in your work. I'll begin by providing some building blocks and some basic concepts. Prior to today's training, I received many excellent questions, and so in the second part of the training, I will try to address as many of those as possible. In the third part of the training, we'll talk about consequences of sanctions, and that includes secondary sanctions. Then we'll talk about compliance. I'll try to provide a framework that will help you make your compliance programs as risk-based and efficient and cost-effective as possible. I'll also provide some resources that you can use to stay up to date on sanctions developments. And lastly, with whatever time is remaining, we will open the floor to questions, and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. But of course, if you have further questions after the training, do not hesitate to reach out. We're going to conclude promptly at 5:30. With that, we'll move to the first section and we'll begin with a polling question so I can get a little bit of information about you. The question is, when was the last time you had a sanctions compliance training? Was it within the past 3 months, within the past 6 months, within the past year, more than a year ago, or never at all? Please select the answer which represents your perspective, and then we'll look at those, and that will help me gauge the level of basic knowledge that the group might have.
Okay, we'll keep this on for another 10 seconds. Nick, we've got about 66% responses. Shall we end voting?
Why don't we go ahead and end voting?
Okay. So these are the results.
Wow, that's very interesting. So it looks like about 30% have not received a sanctions training ever before. So welcome. This is your first training. I'm happy I get to be part of that experience. It looks like only 8% have had a training within the past 3 months, 15% within the past 6 months, 12% within the past year, and 21% it was more than a year ago. So it looks like there's a little bit of a range. That's fine. I'm going to try to make the as relevant to all of you as possible. So with that, why don't we go ahead and begin today's training by looking at some building blocks and basic concepts for OFAC compliance. These building blocks are shown on the screen. I want to teach you who has to follow OFAC sanctions. I want to teach you what the US financial system really is. I want to talk about comprehensive sanctions. I'll talk about the SDN list, and then we're going to look at a case study. Later on, we'll look at the sectoral sanctions identified for the SSI list. Whenever you're learning a new topic or you're studying to improve your knowledge, it's important to create categories and to learn the basic characteristics of each of those categories. And that's how I like to teach. So as I'm going through the presentation, I'll be breaking things down into categories and describing for you the characteristics of each category. And by building up that knowledge, we'll be able to address more and more complex cases. So the first categories I want to introduce are US persons and non-US persons. Whenever we talk about economic sanctions and we talk about OFAC compliance, we divide the world into US persons and non-US persons. Now the other categories I want you to remember are primary sanctions and secondary sanctions. These are two different concepts, they're two different categories, and we're going to treat them separately in today's training. The first one we're going to talk about is primary sanctions. So when we're talking about the building blocks, we're talking about primary sanctions. So let's begin on the left-hand side and talk about US persons. The basic rule here is that US persons have to follow OFAC regulations 100% of the time. I'm a US person, so if I'm in the United States, if I'm in Hong Kong, if I'm in Dhaka, or even if I'm on the moon, I have to follow OFAC sanctions because I'm a US person. The rule is different for non-US persons, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's define what US persons are. US persons include US citizens and permanent residents. Those are green card holders, and they are US persons wherever they are in the world. It also includes anybody who is physically located inside the United States, regardless of their nationality. So if anybody on the webinar today visits the United States, for the period of time that you're inside the United States, you would be considered a US person for the purpose of OFAC regulations. But the moment that you leave, you are no longer a US person because you've left US territory. It also includes entities which are domiciled in the United States. So that includes companies, nonprofit organizations, or other organizations which are incorporated inside the United States. It also includes their foreign offices. It includes overseas branches of US financial institutions. This is a very important concept, and we'll talk about it some more on the next slide. Includes owned companies in the States only for the purposes of Iran and Cuba. For example, if a company is controlled by a US, then the company will have to follow the Iran and Cuba sanctions regulations. Finally, there was recently and entities that are owned or controlled by US financial institutions, no matter where they are in the world, now have to follow North Korea sanctions. So you can see that the definition of US persons, it's a little bit complicated, but if you think through each element, it's also very rational. And the basic rule is that if you are a US person, you must follow OFAC sanctions 100% of the time. Now let's look at the second column and talk about non-US persons. Today's training is focused on non-US persons. I want to talk about how OFAC sanctions affects companies and individuals outside of the United States. So we're really going to focus on the second column. And the general rule is that non-US persons do not have OFAC completions except when they are engaged in it. And that's whenever we're looking at activities outside of the United States, the first thing we do is we try to identify a US element. And there are 3 US elements. They are US persons, the US financial system, and US origin goods and technology. We're not going to talk very much about the third item, which is US origin goods and technology. We'll touch on it a little bit in the second part of the training. But what we're really going to focus on today is the middle one, the US financial system. That is what's going to be most important for banks in Bangladesh and anywhere else in the world when they're interacting with the US financial system. That's where most of the OFAC risk is, and almost all of the big OFAC settlements have involved the US financial system. So that's our first category, US persons, non-US persons. We're going to focus on non-US persons for today's training. So let's talk about the US financial system. What is the US financial system? It has 5 parts. These parts are derived from OFAC regulations, and I've included the regulations on the right-hand side of the slide so that you can look them up whenever you would like in order to confirm your understanding of this concept. On the left-hand side, I've listed the 5 elements of the US financial system. The first element is US banks, banks that are incorporated in the United States. That's pretty easy, that's logical. We would expect that banks like Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan, and other US banks would be part of the US financial system. However, it also includes their foreign branches. As you would know, a foreign branch is an unincorporated office of a financial institution which is licensed to operate in another country. We say in the legal profession that it shares the legal personality of the parent. So a branch of a US bank is also part of the US financial system. And the way that you know that an entity is a branch of a US financial institution is that it has NA in its name. NA stands for National Association. It's the term for a federally licensed bank in the United States. So if you're doing a wire transfer and it involves Citibank NA in Singapore or Citibank NA in London, those are branches of Citibank. They're part of the US financial system, and they are also considered US persons. So they need to follow OFAC regulations 100% of the time. Some banks, including banks in Bangladesh and many other parts of the world, have branches inside the United States. So for example, they may have a branch in New York. That branch is part of the US financial system. I want to be very clear. It is only the branch which is inside the United States which is part of the US financial system. So for example, the Bank of China has a branch in New York. That branch is part of the US financial system because it's located in US territory. But the Bank of China in Beijing is not part of the US financial system. We're only focused on the part of the bank which is inside the United States. The fourth element is US correspondent accounts. Now this is the most important element for banks outside the United States because many banks have correspondent banking accounts in the United States in order to have access to US dollar clearing. Those US correspondent accounts are part of the US financial system, and that means that transactions that go through those accounts must comply with OFAC regulations 100% of the time. Now the last element is foreign subsidiaries of US persons or US financial institutions. If we go back to our definition of US persons, we'll remember that US owned or controlled companies overseas and entities owned or controlled by US financial institutions are subject to the Cuba, Iran, and North Korea regulations. So if we carry that concept over, then we know that a foreign subsidiary of a US bank is going to be subject to the Iran, Cuba, and North Korea sanctions programs. So for example, in Hong Kong, we have Citibank Hong Kong Limited. That is a foreign subsidiary of Citibank. It is subject to the Iran, Cuba, and North Korea sanctions program. It's different than a branch. However, most US financial institutions will apply their sanctions policies globally. And so even though, from a legal perspective, Citibank Hong Kong Limited or any other subsidiary of a US bank are subject to fewer regulations, they act like all of them apply because that's a risk-based decision that they've made for their compliance program. So I want you to keep these elements in mind. We're going to use them later to do an exercise. But I also want you to look at this slide and remember that there is no reference to US dollars in any of these definitions. And that's very important. OFAC regulations do not use the term US dollars for these issues because OFAC jurisdiction is not based on currency. Many people like to say that if they do their transactions in USD, they're subject to OFAC, and if they do their transactions in non-USD, they're not subject to OFAC. But that is a misunderstanding. Actually, it's based on the legal vehicle. So if you have Citibank NA in London processing a transaction in euro, because Citibank London is a foreign branch of Citibank, it is part of the US financial system. It is a US person, and even though they have regulations 100% of the time. So it's not really about the currency. It's going to be about the legal vehicle that's involved. And that's why it's really important to know how your transactions are being processed. The flip side of that is that if you have a transaction that's in US dollar and it does not involve one of these 5 elements, then it is not subject to OFAC jurisdiction. So you can have US dollar transactions outside of the US financial system which are not subject to OFAC regulations. That's also a very important detail. So I want you to keep in mind that it's not about the currency, it's going to be about the legal vehicle that's involved in our transaction. Now let's talk about the SDN list. Many of you are going to be familiar already with the SDN list. It's the list of specially designated nationals and blocked persons. This is OFAC's most important list, and it identifies individuals, entities, and vessels that are sanctioned under different OFAC regulations. What I want you to remember is that the SDN list can be broken down into sublists, and so I've listed them here. You can see that we have country-specific lists and then we have global lists. The country-specific lists are often confusing. Some people believe that if a country has an OFAC list named after it, then that country is sanctioned. However, that is not true. For example, Somalia, South Sudan, Nicaragua, Libya, and other countries which are on this list have OFAC programs named after them, but that does not mean that the country is entirely sanctioned. It is still okay to do transactions with those countries. What this means is that there are individuals or entities that are in those countries which are on the SDN list. And the reason they're on that SDN list has to do with a political situation or an emergency or some other issue inside of that country. The global list, on the other hand, we can find those individuals and entities anywhere in the world. So for example, there are transnational criminal organizations in Japan and other countries. There are global Magnitsky targets in dozens of countries, including China. And there are cyber-related designations that have been made against targets that are in Russia. So we really need to think about the SDN list in a very flexible way. And remember that we can find SDNs in almost any country in the world. And just because a country has a list that's been named after it, that does not mean that the country has been sanctioned entirely. Now, what does it mean when somebody is on the SDN list? Well, it basically means two things. It means that US persons are not allowed to have any business or dealings with a person on the SDN list or a company on the SDN list. So that's the first impact. And remember, US persons has a special definition, which we talked about earlier. The second thing that it means is that property and interest in property are frozen when they come into US jurisdiction. US jurisdiction means two things here. It means when the property is inside the United States, and it means when the property is under the control of a US person. Property is really broadly defined, and it can include really almost anything. I've used some examples here, but if you go to the OFAC regulations, you'll see that there's many, many more examples of what property means. This is important because we can often have situations where there are transactions outside of the United States that involve the US financial system or involve a US person. And when those transactions reach the US person or the US financial system, they have to be frozen. That's what the regulations say. So while non-US persons are able to have business with SDNs if they want to, the moment that they begin to interact with US persons or the US financial system, that property can get frozen. So that's why it's important, again, to remember who we're doing business with so that the property doesn't get frozen unexpectedly. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is the 50% rule. What the 50% rule says is that if an entity is owned 50% or more by SDNs, then the entity is treated just like the SDN owner. That means that the property and interest in property are blocked, and US persons are not able to do business with that entity. Now, the second part of the 50% rule says that we have to add together the shares of all of the SDN owners. So for example, if you have two SDNs and they both own a portion of a company, and each SDN owns 30% each, we add that together and we get 60%. 60% is more than 50%, and so we would have to treat their company like an SDN. The third thing that I want you to remember is that the 50% rule travels downhill. It does not go uphill. And what that means is that if a company is sanctioned, that does not mean that its parent is sanctioned. It only goes downhill. So we look at the subsidiaries. And we'll look at this on the next slide. Lastly, remember that the 50% rule also applies to the SSI list in addition to the SDN list. So here's an example. So whenever we look at a picture like this, we have to begin at the top and we work our way down. And the reason is because the 50% rule travels downhill. It doesn't go uphill. So we begin at the top and we have an SDN, or we might have an SSI entity. And in this picture, what I've shown you is that they have two subsidiaries. One of the subsidiaries is owned 55%. The other subsidiary is owned 49%. Because the 50% rule only applies when there's 50% or more ownership, subsidiary 1 would be treated like an SDN. Subsidiary 2 would not. Then we go one more level down. Because subsidiary 1 is treated like an SDN, we have to look at its subsidiaries. We can see in this example that it owns subsidiary X 100% and subsidiary Y 25%. So we apply the 50% rule again, and we see that subsidiary X is treated like an SDN. Then we look at subsidiary A at the bottom, and we see that it is only owned 20% by subsidiary X. So it escapes the 50% rule. The reason this is so important is because you will have cases where you're performing due diligence and you find that the beneficial owners of your customer or of a counterparty are on the SDN list. And if that happens and their ownership is 50% or more, you have to treat your customer or the counterparty like an SDN. That means that you should not have transactions with them through the US financial system or with US persons. And if you do, that property most likely will get frozen. Let's change subjects a little bit and talk about comprehensive sanctions. These are also called embargoes. There are 5 territories which are currently subject to US comprehensive sanctions. They are Crimea, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. There are only 5. You will often see lists that include countries like Libya, or Myanmar, or Iraq, or Sudan. Those lists are out of date. As of today, these are the only 5 countries. The basic rule, very simple, US persons are not allowed to have transactions with these territories directly or indirectly. And that word indirectly is really important, and I'm going to use that on the next slide to illustrate a very typical OFAC violation. Some of you may be wondering why Venezuela is not on the list, and that is because Venezuela is not a comprehensively sanctioned territory. The government of Venezuela is sanctioned, and there are many individuals and entities in Venezuela which are sanctioned, but the territory as a whole is not subject to sanctions. So it's only these 5 territories currently. Let's use an example to show you how all of this fits together. So I've created a scenario where we have a supplier who's based in Bangladesh, and the buyer agrees to supply goods to a buyer in Iran. Now, first of all, that might be perfectly legal under law in Bangladesh. And so the fact that the Bangladesh company and the Iranian company have business together, that really doesn't matter. We're looking for the US element. So the next part of the story is that the buyer arranges to have a payment made in USD via an intermediary, which is a distributor who is in Dubai. The distributor in Dubai goes to the bank in Dubai and makes the payment, which then has to clear through a correspondent network in order to reach the supplier's bank in Dhaka. You can see in the picture, I've indicated at the top with the yellow burst that once the payment reaches the US financial system, the bank in New York, that's where the OFAC violation occurs. You can see on the picture that we have a shipment and we have an order, but as I said, that might be legal under the the law in Bangladesh. And so that's not the problem. The problem is when the payment happens and it goes through the US financial system. That's where the OFAC violation happens. I want to point a couple of other things out. You'll notice that we've put an intermediary into the story. There's a distributor in Dubai who is making the payment on behalf of the buyer in Iran. That is called indirect. When OFAC says that US persons cannot participate in transactions involving Iran directly or indirectly, this is what they mean. So the fact that we've broken this into two parts does not make it okay. If the Dubai distributor knows that the Iranian buyer is the source of the payment and processes the payment through the US financial system using the bank in Dubai, that is an OFAC violation. This is really important because there are so many transactions that go through the US financial system through intermediaries in third countries, like Dubai or Singapore or other countries. I want to go back to some of the other things that we just talked about and play with this picture a little bit to help you illustrate how it works. So imagine that instead of having the Iranian buyer, imagine that we had an SDN who was located in Bangladesh, or we had an SDN who was located in Hong Kong, or we had an SDN who was located in Dubai. We would get the same result. As soon as the payment reaches the US financial system, it would be a violation because SDNs are not allowed to process transactions through the US financial system. Let's try a different example. Let's imagine that we have a company that's owned 50% or more by an SDN. Then we would get, again, the same result. Because when we have a company that's owned 50% or more by an SDN, we treat the company just like an SDN. That's what the 50% rule says. So those transactions should not go through the US financial system. So you can see we can play with this picture in different ways to see how the basic concepts apply. And I hope this will be helpful to you in your work because you'll be able to see whether or not transactions that your customers are processing might have a problem with them. Now, sometimes people ask, they say, well, what happens if the supplier in Bangladesh gets the order directly from the distributor in Dubai? Wouldn't that be okay? And the answer is that it depends what the supplier knows. If the supplier knows that the transaction involves a buyer in Iran, and they place the order with the distributor in Dubai and accept the payment, that would still be a violation from OFAC's perspective because they knew that the transaction related to Iran. OFAC is always thinking about what people know or what they should have known. So that was the first part of the lesson. We looked at who is required to follow OFAC regulations. We looked at SDNs. We looked at the US financial system. And we looked at an example that helps us put those basic concepts together. Now I'm going to take you through the rest of the training and I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated, but we're going to use those basic building blocks to explain some more complicated scenarios. So before we go on, we'd like to do another polling question. So Arpita, could you please?
Yes.
So the question is, how do you usually answer your OFAC compliance questions? Do you conduct your own research using the internet? Do you ask a specialist on your team or consult an internal resource? Do you consult an external specialist or do you contact OFAC directly for guidance? Take a moment, think about how you normally answer OFAC questions and select the answer that represents the best one for you. We'll give everybody about 15 seconds and then we'll move along.
Sure. May I also request all the attendees to please not put the answers in the chat box. Please answer them on your screen. Okay, Nick, I'm going to end voting.
Okay,
Here are the
great.
results.
So here we go. Oh, this is very interesting. So 20% of you conduct research using the internet, which is great, and I hope some of the things I share today will enhance your ability to do that. 43% of you, so that's a really good percentage, have an internal specialist or resource that you can consult, and that's fantastic. Only 1% of you consult external specialists, and 22% say that you've contacted OFAC for guidance. And I want to say that OFAC really appreciates that. They like when banks reach out and ask questions, and they have people whose job it is to answer questions for the public. So that's a fantastic resource as well. Great. Why don't we go ahead and return back to the slides? So these next few slides are based on questions that I received before today's session. So my goal is to try to answer questions in advance that will be interesting to the audience. And again, I'm going to use those basic concepts that we talked about earlier to try to build up our knowledge. Now, the different scenarios that we're going to talk about involve the movement of goods through landlocked countries via Iran, vessels that are passing through Iranian waters or ports, humanitarian transactions, Russia sanctions, U.S. export controls, and the shipping sector. So these are all things that came up prior to today's session that I thought I would be able to talk about. So let's look at the first one. And let's talk about the movement of goods through landlocked countries via Iran. So as you know, there are several countries in the region that when they produce goods, they need to move those by land through Iran in order to get to a port. And that's perfectly normal. It happens a lot. And that is not a problem on its own. The issue is when there's a U.S. element involved. So we're going to go back to that idea of U.S. element that I introduced earlier in the presentation. The basic principle is on the left-hand side, and then I've provided the regulation on the right-hand side so that you can go and check the source yourself and get a little bit more detail. The basic principle for these issues is that under the Iranian Transactions and Sanctions Regulations, the ITSR, which is the major OFAC sanctions regulation for Iran, goods that pass through Iranian commerce are generally treated as Iranian origin. U.S. persons and the U.S. financial system are not allowed to be involved in transactions directly or indirectly related to Iranian origin goods. So even if you have cotton, which is grown in a country like Uzbekistan, and it passes through Iran in order to get to Bandar Abbas or another port, OFAC looks at that cotton as Iranian origin. Even though it wasn't really grown there, that's how OFAC treats it. And that comes from a definition which is in the regulations where it says that Iranian origin goods includes goods that have entered into Iranian commerce. So what this means is that if you have a transaction that involves goods that have passed through Iran, you should not process transactions through the U.S. financial system in relation to those goods unless you have an OFAC license or exemption that applies to the transaction. I think the rule is pretty simple, but the examples come up a lot. And usually the recommendation in those cases is to not process transactions through the US financial system. However, if there are other ways of processing the transaction that do not involve the US financial system or US persons, those would not be subject to OFAC regulations. And so for purposes of primary sanctions, you would be able to process the transactions outside of the US financial system. So that's the first issue. Now there's a very closely related issue, which is about vessels that pass through Iranian waters or ports. And this one's really tricky because many financial institutions have very strict policies on this issue. But the regulations are actually pretty flexible. What the regulations say, what the ITSR say, is that vessels that only pass through Iranian waters or stop at Iranian ports as part of their village are not subject to the ITSR prohibitions. What OFAC is really focused on is the goods and whether those goods have passed through Iranian commerce. So if you look at the ITSR at 560.306b, you can see that the term Iranian origin goods does not include goods transported on a vessel or aircraft that passed through Iranian territorial waters or stopped at a port or place in Iran that did not otherwise come into contact with Iran. So for example, if you have a vessel and it's traveling from Europe to China or to somewhere else, and it stops at Iran, but the goods that you're interested in, that you're financing, were not offloaded, that they did not pass through Iranian customs, then this part of the ITSR would apply, and you would be able to process a transaction through the US financial system. However, even though that's what the rule says, there are many financial institutions that will not accept those transactions because they have strict policies for risk management reasons. But this is still important information because if you're looking at a transaction and you're wondering if there's an OFAC violation, you may want to consider whether or not this rule applies, because then that would give you some comfort that the transaction is okay, even if your counterparty bank does not want to process the transaction. Now, the next issue that came up was humanitarian transactions. So I provided a link to a document which came out recently from OFAC that gave us guidance on OFAC's views on humanitarian transactions. Now, the first thing that you need to know is that OFAC encourages humanitarian transactions. OFAC wants companies all over the world and individuals to support humanitarian projects, especially nowadays because of the global pandemic. In order to allow that to happen, there are general licenses and exemptions which are written into OFAC regulations. So if you read the regulations very closely, you'll often find a rule that says that certain transactions are allowed. And they include humanitarian transactions and usually exports of agricultural goods, medicine, medical devices, and other humanitarian related transactions. So that's good news. The issue, which makes it a little bit complicated, is that a lot of the general licenses are written so that they only apply to US persons. And this is true for all of the OFAC programs except for Syria. So for example, if you have a company or a nonprofit, NGO in Bangladesh, and they're exporting humanitarian goods to Iran, and they want to process a transaction through the US financial system, they probably won't be able to do that because the license in the ITSR for humanitarian transactions only applies to US persons. So you would need to have a US company or a US NGO that was engaged in the activity. So foreign entities usually don't get to benefit from it. Syria is a little bit different. You can process transactions through the US financial system for some humanitarian transactions involving Syria, no matter what the nationality of the parties is. Now, the last thing that I want you to know about humanitarian transactions is that US financial institutions are usually allowed to process transactions which are ordinarily incident to a licensed transaction. What that means is that if you have somebody shipping some items to a sanctioned territory and the shipment is covered by a license, that could be a general license or a specific license, then banks are allowed to process payments in connection with that shipment because the payments are incident to the shipment, so they're allowed. You don't need to get a separate license for the payments. It's all included in the original license. Now, the next thing I wanted to share was another link to a resource that my law firm produced, which is related to the OFAC guidance, where we created a chart which you can find online that shows you the different licenses for each of the programs for Crimea, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela, so you can see if a transaction might be covered by an OFAC general license or exemption. So it's a useful resource that might help you answer some of those questions, and you can find it at the link here in this slide. So that's all I have on humanitarian transactions for now. The next issue I was asked to talk about was Russia sanctions. And what I want you to know about Russia is, first of all, Russia is not a sanctioned territory like Iran or Cuba or Syria. But Russia is subject to a lot of different small sanctions programs. And there are 4 main programs that you should know about, which I've listed here on the slide. The first is the embargo against Crimea. Crimea is a territory that's in between Russia and Ukraine. US persons are not allowed, and the US financial system is not allowed, to be involved in transactions related to Crimea. The second is the sectoral sanctions program, and I'm going to talk about that on the next 2 slides. But the sectoral sanctions program restricts US persons from engaging in specific transactions involving companies which are on the SSI list. So that was something which was created just for Russia. And that happened after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. So the Crimea embargo and the sectoral sanctions are related. Finally, there's the SDN sanctions program, which, as we talked about earlier, if an individual or company in Russia is on the SDN list, that means that US persons in the US financial system are not allowed to be involved in transactions with that person. And it means that their property is frozen when it's under US jurisdiction. At the bottom, I mentioned there are secondary sanctions. The secondary sanctions are not used very much, and they're very, very limited. They were introduced under a law called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which was passed in 2017. And there are certain transactions with Russian SDNs or involving the Russian military which can lead to secondary sanctions. And we'll talk about secondary sanctions a little bit later in the training. The last thing that I want to mention is about Crimea. Crimea is a little bit tricky because it's not really a country, it's a territory. It's a part of another country. This creates a problem for sanction screening because sanction screening filters sometimes look for the country name. But since Crimea is not a country, it can sometimes appear as Russia and sometimes it appears as Ukraine. And it's not easy to find if all you're looking is for the country. And so what OFAC recommends is that you search for the city name. So you search for cities or ports or other geographic references in Crimea in order to get effective sanction screening. So that's a special guidance that came out in 2015. So with that overview done, let's zero in on the SSI list, because this often creates a little bit of confusion, and I want to try to make it clear. So we've talked about the SDN list, and that's one category. So we talked about the characteristics of the SDN list. So keep that in your mind, and remember that that's really the highest punishment or the highest list that OFAC has for individuals or entities. If it really, really wants to target them, it puts them on the SDN list. Now create another category in your mind and put the SSI list in the second category. And the SSI list is not as bad as the SDN list. It's more targeted. And specifically, it uses 3 different directives. And the directives are targeted at the Russian financial sector, the Russian energy sector, and the Russian defense sector. And it only applies to companies that are on the SSI list. So for example, it's not all Russian banks. It's the Russian banks which are on the SSI list. It's not all Russian energy companies or all Russian defense companies. It's only the ones that are on the SSI list. When a company is put on the SSI list, what happens is that U.S. persons are prohibited from engaging in certain transactions, limited transactions involving debt or equity of the company which is on the SSI list. I'm going to show you on the next slide how to make decisions about SSI hits when you get them in your screening filters. But just remember that if you're dealing with an SSI entity, we're looking for a U.S. element because that's an OFAC primary sanctions issue. And when we talk about primary sanctions, we're always looking for a U.S. element. And we also want to think about the type of transaction because we're only looking for debt and equity transactions. Now this slide is a little bit complicated because the 3 columns have a lot of text in them, but it's actually pretty simple. In the middle column, we have something called period or tenor or length. And that's referring to the date when the SSI sanctions become effective. The middle column refers to the period when the SSI sanctions were, and the third column refers to the tenor of debt. And I'll show you on the next slide how to use this information. But if we're dealing with a hit on the SSI list, and we think that it involves equity or debt, then we look at the middle column, and we find out when the equity or the debt was issued. And if it falls within one of the date ranges, then the SSI rules apply. But if it falls before the date ranges, before the SSI sanctions were applied, then the rules don't apply to that debt or equity. Now the last column is only for debt, and what you'll see is that the SSI list focuses on debt of certain lengths. So it used to be, for example, for Russian financial institutions on the list, that U.S. persons could deal in debt of less than 90 days maturity. But then they tightened the rules, and it became 30 days maturity, and then they tightened the rules again, and it's 14 days maturity. So I'm a U.S. person, and if I want to provide legal services to a Russian company who's on the SSI list, and they fall under the first category, Directive 1, when I issue them an invoice, I have to make sure that it's less than 14 days payment terms, because that's what the SSI rules say for U.S. persons. But remember, we're talking about non-U.S. persons today, and so these rules don't strictly apply to non-U.S. persons. They only apply when the transaction is going through the U.S. financial system. So let's look at this slide here, and it's some basic rules for handling SSI questions for financial institutions. If we go back to this slide, I know some of you are asking why I skipped the bottom row for Directive 4. That's because Directive 4 says that it does not just focus on 1, 2, and 3. So when we have an SSI hit on our screening filter, there's 7 steps that I usually recommend. The first is we always have to confirm that it's a true match. So we want to make sure that we're dealing with a true match. And once we know that it's a true match, we have to figure out if Directive 1 applies, or 2, or 3, because each directive has different rules. So remember, Directive 1 is for financial institutions, Directive 2 is for the energy sector, Directive 3 is for the defense sector. So we find out which directive our company fits into, and it will say right on the SSI list what directive it is. The next thing we do is we look for debt or equity. Remember that the word debt is super broad. It means bonds, it means letters of credit, it means invoices, or any other kind of debt. Equity just means shares, normal equity. So if we're dealing with debt or equity, then the SSI rules may apply. If what we're dealing with is not debt or equity, or the debt or equity does not belong to the SSI entity, then there's nothing we need to do. We can just forget about it. The next step is to determine the SSI entity's role in the transaction. This is really important. So let's imagine that we have a company in Bangladesh, and it's receiving a payment from a company in Russia. Now, the company in Russia is not on the SDN list. It is not on the SSI list. Actually, the SSI hit is against the company's bank. So our company in Bangladesh is receiving a payment from its counterparty in Russia, and the counterparty has a Russian bank, and the Russian bank is on the SSI list. Well, the only question we need to ask is, does the debt belong to the financial institution or to the financial institution's customer? In this story, it belongs to the customer. It's the customer in Russia who is paying your client in Bangladesh. That does not belong to the SSI bank. The bank is just processing the payment on behalf of its client. So in those cases, the SSI rules would not apply. So we always look at who the debt or equity belongs to. The next thing we do is we compare the dates. So we go back to the chart, or we go to the OFAC website, and we look at the periods, and we see if it falls within the date ranges. Then we look at the length of the debt, and we see if it falls within the third column, or whether it's too short to fall in. And then finally, if we finally got to the end of this process and we realize that we're dealing with debt or equity, which is subject to the SSI and the SSI rules, the last thing we do is look for a US element. And if we have a US element, then it's not allowed. If we do not have a US element, then the SSI rules would not apply. Some banks may do this process in reverse, and they start with number 7, and they say, well, there's no US element, and so the SSI rules don't apply, and they just close the matter. But I would recommend going through the whole process because I think it gives you a more complete answer. Now, the next question I received was about US export controls. And the issue here is whether or not a company in Bangladesh could get in trouble for re-exporting goods which come from the United States. And the answer is maybe. But actually, the risk isn't as big as you think. So let me explain a little bit how this works. When we're talking about export controls, we're talking about a different regulator from OFAC. OFAC focuses on financial services and the activities of US persons. There's another entity or agency which is in the Commerce Department. It's kind of like a cousin for OFAC, and it's called the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. And BIS is focused on US origin goods and technology. And they have a set of regulations which are called the Export Administration Regulations. The Export Administration Regulations apply to all U.S. origin items and any item that is passed through the United States, and it also includes some non-U.S. origin items. So you may have heard of something called the de minimis rule, and it says that if something is produced in another country and it contains a certain percentage of U.S. origin material, then the foreign item is subject to the Export Administration regulations. It's only very specific items. It's an analysis that we don't have time to talk about here, but really it's your customer's responsibility to know whether or not their products are subject to the Export Administration regulations. It's not the bank's role to do that analysis. It's very complicated, and so normally banks will ask their customer to provide a certification. But what you need to understand is that when an item is subject to the Export Administration regulations, there can be limitations on exporting the item from the United States, re-exporting the item from a different country to another country, or transferring the item between two persons inside the same country. And so that's what we're worried about here. And this usually comes up for banks because of something called the entity list. And there are companies like Huawei, for example, which are on the entity list. And what the entity list says is that both U.S. persons and non-U.S. persons are prohibited from exporting, re-exporting, or transferring items which are subject to the EAR to a person on the entity list without authorization from BIS. That is very, very specific, and other activities are perfectly okay. So, if you're a bank and you're doing your name screening against a customer or against a counterparty, and you get a hit against the entity list, what you need to be thinking about is whether or not the transactions involve items which are subject to the Export Administration regulations, and whether or not those items are being sent to the entity which is on the entity list. So that's the basic rule. And again, this is something that the customer should be able to certify because the customers are responsible for understanding how these rules apply to their business. Now, the question that often comes up is whether or not financial institutions can get in trouble under the Export Administration regulations. And the answer is that they can, because there's a rule called General Prohibition 10, which makes it illegal to facilitate other people's activities if they are violating the rules under the EAR. But in order for that to apply, you have to have knowledge or a reason to know. There have never been cases involving financial institutions under General Prohibition 10, so we can't say very much about how BIS would use that rule. So what we recommend instead is that financial institutions conduct risk-based due diligence and document their decisions when they have a customer or counterparty on the entity list, because if in the future they need to demonstrate that they did not have knowledge or a reason to know that there was a violation of these rules, they would be able to produce that evidence. So that's a basic overview of the entity list and U.S. export controls. Now, the last part of this section is about the shipping sector. And what I wanted to talk about was a guidance that came out 2 days ago. I've included the link here so that you can find the guidance, but it contains some really, really interesting information for maritime companies, insurers, financial institutions, and other participants in the international shipping sector. And it provides guidance for helping them identify sanctions evasion. And on page 17 of the document, there are some specific considerations for financial institutions. And what they're looking for are customers or transactions that involve ship-to-ship transfers or high-risk regions, They want to see that banks are assessing their clients' business. They want to make sure that banks are looking for transactions which are inconsistent with their customers' normal behavior. And whenever the client is involved in the sale or acquisition of a vessel, that may be a red flag if that vessel is involved in high-risk activity. So I won't go into too much detail about this. The document just came out 2 days ago, and you're welcome to find it and read it. But the point that I want to make is two things. First of all, when you have unusual activity involving ships, you have to also think about whether that may involve trade-based money laundering and whether or not the bank has an obligation to file an STR with the local regulator. Because when we see unusual shipping activity, that could either be an indication of sanctions evasion or of trade-based money laundering. So we need to think of both. The second thing is that a lot of people ask, what are banks really responsible for? Do we have to know all of the ship's behavior? Do we have to track the vessel's history? Do we have to look at the AIS data? And the answer is that from OFAC, there is no strict regulation on what you're required to do. What OFAC hopes that banks will do is to have a risk-based compliance program. And when they identify unusual activity, they will investigate that activity and they will not engage in transactions which could violate OFAC regulations if they're not certain about the underlying activity. So actually that is very similar to what the AML expectations are. And so in the shipping sector, when we talk about this, we often try to merge the sanctions and the AML controls because they both can be effective in this situation. Now, that was the second part of the training, and I'm going to go to the third part, but first we have another polling question. Arpita?
Yes.
So, in your opinion, do your colleagues and customers view sanctions as an important risk? Yes, no, or maybe sometimes. I'll give you about 15 seconds to think about it and to put in your answer, and then we'll talk about the results.
Okay, Nick, I'll close the voting.
Okay. Great. So, this is really good news. So it looks like 68% of you believe that your colleagues and customers view sanction as an important risk. I'm really glad to hear that. Only 1% of you said no. So that's really good news. 19% said sometimes, and I think that's probably reasonable because sometimes sanctions are an important risk and sometimes there are other risks which are more important than sanctions. So that's really interesting, but I'm glad to see that it's top of mind for a lot of you and for your colleagues. So returning back to the training slides, I want to talk very quickly, not in very much detail, but pretty quickly about consequences of sanctions. And the reason I like to talk about this is because I got a lot of questions before the training about whether or not banks in Bangladesh need to follow OFAC regulations, or whether or not it's optional. And as we talked about in the first part, OFAC regulations do not apply to non-US persons unless they're involved in transactions involving US elements. So the first part of the answer is that yes, banks in Bangladesh need to follow OFAC regulations when they're involved in transactions involving a US element, like the US financial system, because those transactions have to follow the OFAC rules. But when there is no US element, then there is some flexibility. But your counterparties, including your correspondents, might have stricter policies or higher expectations, and they are probably thinking about some of these consequences when they make those decisions. And so I just want to talk about them quickly so that you have them in your mind, so that you can think about these risks when you're designing your own sanctions programs. First of all, I want to show you a little map of the major U.S. regulatory agencies that have responsibility for sanctions. And the reason I want to show you this is because I want you to understand that it's a little complicated. It's not just OFAC, it's also the State Department, it's the Commerce Department, it's the Department of Justice, it's the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the FDIC, and for banks that have licenses from U.S. states like New York, California, Illinois, they also have to deal with state regulators. So there's a lot of regulation that you have to worry about if you're a U.S. bank or if you have a branch inside the United States. And all of these regulators are concerned with sanctions, and they put a lot of pressure on banks to have the highest standards. So that's one of the reasons why OFAC sanctions have a lot of power in the world, because of the regulatory reach of these agencies. So let's talk for a minute about secondary sanctions, because I think this is the big risk that most banks are concerned about. Secondary sanctions are different from primary sanctions. When we talk about primary sanctions, we're talking about jurisdiction, we're talking about there's no U.S. element, there's no U.S. financial system, there's no U.S. person. These are just activities which are offensive to U.S. policy. So they're a national security concern, or they involve a foreign adversary of the United States, or some other issue that the U.S. government is concerned about. And so the U.S. government attempts to use the U.S. financial system as leverage to discourage non-U.S. companies and individuals from engaging in that activity. So that's the first thing I want you to know. There's no jurisdiction. It's really about power. The second thing I want you to know is that secondary sanctions are targeted. So they do not apply to everything. It's only the things that are specified in the secondary sanctions. And I'll explain this in a minute. The example that I wanted to show you happened recently, and this was with a company called Costco, which is a major Chinese shipping line. And they had two subsidiaries which were put on the SDN list because those subsidiaries had participated in petroleum exports from Iran. Now, this was very complicated because not only were the subsidiaries affected, but because of the 50% rule, all of the vessels that they owned and the JVs that they participated in, 50% or more, were also affected. So it became very complicated for their counterparties to figure out what to do. One of the subsidiaries was removed from the SDN list in January, but another one is still on the list. So let's look at Iran as an example. As I mentioned, secondary sanctions only apply to specific activities. And usually the activity has to be significant. And there's a definition in the OFAC FAQs for significant, and it has 7 factors. But we're only looking at these specific activities. So with Iran, the activities were laid out in a series of executive orders from August 2018, May 2019, and January 2020. The issue was that we had the JCPOA, which was an international agreement, and then the Trump administration decided to leave the JCPOA, and they decided to put secondary sanctions back in place. And remember, secondary sanctions are meant to put pressure on non-US companies and individuals And in this case, the Trump administration wanted to put pressure to get the Iranian government to agree to stop certain activities that the Trump administration didn't like. And in the executive orders, they list the specific sectors or types of transactions that are covered by the secondary sanctions. I've listed them here. The big one is Iranian SDNs. If you have a transaction involving an Iranian SDN, which could be an Iranian financial institution or the government of Iran or another Iranian SDN, and it's a significant transaction, that could lead to secondary sanctions. In May 2019, it was expanded to cover the iron, steel, aluminum, and copper sectors. And in January, it was expanded to include transactions involving Iran's construction, mining, manufacturing, or textile sectors. So when you're dealing with an Iranian transaction, and let's imagine that you've already concluded that there's no US element. So you say, okay, there's no US element, and so the primary sanctions do not apply. But what about secondary sanctions? Well, the question that you need to ask is whether or not the activity is covered by the secondary sanctions which are in these executive orders. If you have a situation where the transaction involves the export of humanitarian goods, those aren't covered by secondary sanctions unless there's an SDN involved. So you could be pretty comfortable with that. If it was the export from Bangladesh of clothing or toys, something very ordinary, and those went to a non-SDN purchaser, those aren't going to be covered by secondary sanctions. It's really only the items that are covered by these executive orders. Now, correspondent banking and bank secondary sanctions are probably the most important for you guys, so let's talk about those for a moment. There is a list called the CAPTA list, or the Correspondent Account or Payable Through Account Sanctions List. This is an OFAC list that covers several different programs. It includes Russia, Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, and the Hezbollah sanctions program. And what it says is that if a foreign financial institution engages in significant transactions that are covered by the secondary sanctions, they can get put on the CAPTA list. And if you get put on the CAPTA list, then US banks are not allowed to have correspondent accounts with you. Currently, there's only one bank that's on the list. It's the Bank of Kunlun in China. It has been on the list since 2012, and that was because of some transactions related to Iran. So the CAPTA list is a very important one to think about. But actually, you also need to think about the SDN list. The SDN list can also be used against financial institutions. So you might remember in August 2019, Jamal Trust Bank in Lebanon was added to the SDN list under the Global Terrorism Sanctions Regulations because it had engaged in significant transactions involving Hezbollah. So these are the kinds of things that OFAC is looking for and the State Department are looking for. So again, if you're doing transactions and they involve one of these countries or they involve entities or persons on the SDN list, you'll want to think about whether or not there's a secondary sanctions program that applies to that, because there might be some risk there for the bank. Now there's something separate called the Section 311 list. And this is a pretty old list. It's been around since 2001. And it's different from the SDN list. It's different from the CAPTA list. It's managed by an agency called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. And this allows the US Treasury Department to identify foreign money laundering concerns. And that could be a country or a financial institution or a type of transaction or account. And again, when a financial institution is added to the Section 311 list, usually that means that US financial institutions are not allowed to have correspondent accounts for that bank. There were recent examples, including ABLV Bank in Latvia and the Bank of Dandong in China. Now, ABLV Bank, it actually went out of business 4 days after this listing was proposed. because it knew that it would not be able to survive without access to the US financial system. Usually the Section 311 list is used when there's a lot of AML concern in addition to sanctions concern, but it's something to think about if your bank relies on US correspondent accounts. Okay. Now, the next issue that I want to touch on very quickly is US government investigations. And there's 2 points that I want to make. First of all, many banks will never have an OFAC settlement or a DOJ settlement. It's actually pretty rare. But banks get investigated, or their customers get investigated all the time. And investigations can be just as costly as settlements or regulatory penalties. So if you have colleagues who are asking you why sanctions compliance is important, just remind them that they don't want to pay for an investigation because it can be very expensive. However, if your bank is ever involved in a US investigation, remember that there are significant benefits for self-disclosure, cooperation, and remediation during the course of that investigation. And if you want more information on this, you can go to the OFAC Economic Sanctions Enforcement Guidelines or the DOJ Export Control and Sanctions Enforcement Policy. And I've given you the link here for the DOJ policy, and you'll get more information about how the US government looks at those things. But the other thing I wanted to tell you about investigations was that there's a part of the Patriot Act called Section 319B, which has been in the news in the past year a lot. What it does is it allows the US government to get access to bank records which are held outside the United States if they relate to transactions through a US correspondent account. And there was a big court case last year involving 3 Chinese banks who refused to answer the subpoenas, but then they were forced to do so by the US courts. And I wrote an article about this recently in relation to North Korea, and you can find it at this link here, and that will give you some more information. But if your bank has a correspondent account or a branch in the United States, remember that if your customers process transactions through that correspondent account and they get investigated, the Patriot Act allows the US government to get bank records, even if those records are held in Bangladesh. So it's an important risk. Lastly, I was asked to talk about OFAC penalties. Very quickly, I just want to remind you that there are administrative and civil penalties, as well as criminal penalties. Administrative and civil penalties are sometimes financial penalties, so it could be a fine, or it could be something like a caution letter or a finding a violation. In those cases, you don't pay any money, but OFAC puts you on notice that you need to improve your compliance program. But I think most banks are most worried about civil monetary penalties. And you probably have seen some bank cases where the penalties have been really high, like more than $1 billion. What you have to remember is the reason that those are so high is because OFAC is able to charge up to $307,000 US per violation. So if you have 1,000 wire transfers that violated OFAC regulations, you would have to pay this up to 1,000 times. Now, that's why those penalties get so big, because banks process so many transactions. But you can also look at the Economic Sanctions Enforcement Guidelines, and I've provided the link here, because they allow OFAC to reduce the penalty significantly for self-disclosure and cooperation and for compliance remediation. So we also see a lot of OFAC settlements where the penalty is pretty low. It doesn't seem that serious, but that's because the company has done a lot of good cooperation, or they've put in a good compliance program, and OFAC has given them credit for that. Now, criminal penalties only happen when it's very serious, but criminal penalties can be used against companies and individuals. And this involves a prosecution by the Department of Justice. Individuals can be put in prison for violating OFAC regulations if it's a serious case, and individuals and companies both can pay up to $1 million per violation in fines. So again, it can get very, very expensive. So that's the third part, and so that's the risk. That's why banks are so concerned about this. And now in the last part, we're going to talk about compliance, and then I will open it up to some questions. But we have one more poll, so I'll ask Arpita to bring that up, please.
Sure.
So here's the question for you. What is the #1 challenge in complying with economic sanctions at your company? Is it that you do not have enough budget, too little technology, a shortage of know-how, complicated regulations, or just a lack of interest from business and customers? You can only pick one, so pick the one that you think is the most important for your organization, and I'll give everybody about 15 seconds and then we'll move along.
Okay, let me end the voting.
Great. So the largest number was 25%, and it's because the regulations are complicated. I agree, and I hope a little less complicated today through this training. The other top ones were shortage of know-how. So again, I hope we were able to share some knowledge, and in the next part I'll talk about some other resources. Too little technology. Sanctions compliance involves a lot of technology because there's so many transactions and we have to screen them, so technology is really important. The next one was lack of interest from business and customers. I think as people get more educated, I think that they will pay closer attention, but maybe you can share some of the information from the third section of today's training to help convince them that this is an important issue. Now the last one was only 8% of you said not enough budget. That's good news, but I'm sure that that's also a important factor because sanctions compliance can require a lot of resources, and so banks have to make sure that their programs are as efficient as possible, and that's what we'll talk about in the next section. So why don't we go back to the slides. And we're going to talk about compliance, and I'm going to begin by pointing your attention to a document that came out from OFAC in May 2019. It's called the Framework for OFAC Compliance Commitments. The link isn't on this page, but if you Google Framework for OFAC Compliance Commitments, you'll find it right away. It's a pretty short document, but it's been really, really useful. Because what OFAC has done is they've looked at their enforcement cases over the past several years, and they've tried to pull some lessons out of those cases. And they've made recommendations for how to build an effective OFAC compliance program. And there's only really 5 elements that they focus on: senior management commitment, sanctions risk assessment, internal controls, testing and auditing, and training. And the document explains what each of those elements means and what OFAC is looking for. Now, I also like to point out that these 5 elements overlap with AML really well. You also need commitment from senior management, risk assessment, internal controls, testing, and training for AML. And that's why we're able to build our sanctions program into our AML program and try to utilize as much of our AML framework as possible. Now, the other thing is that the framework document encourages a risk-based approach. And this is the secret, I think, to OFAC compliance. When we talk about a risk-based approach for sanctions, what we're talking about is looking at our customers, our products and services, our geographies, and supply chains and counterparties. And we're trying to determine if they're bringing sanctions risk into the bank. So do we have customers on the SDN list or beneficial owners on the SDN list? Are they using high-risk transactions like wire transfers or trade finance? Are they engaged in business with geographies that are subject to sanctions? Or do they have suppliers in their supply chain that are subject to sanctions? Are they importing from sanctioned territories, or are they selling to sanctioned territories? And we look at this and we're able to bucket or categorize our business according to OFAC risk. And then just like AML, we will concentrate our resources on the areas where we have the most risk. Now, the other thing the framework says is that you should look out for your connections with the US financial system. And so when I'm doing a sanctions risk assessment for a client, that's always the first thing I look for. I say, tell me where the US elements are. Tell me where the US financial system is in your business, and let's focus on that for doing compliance. And later on, we can talk about the lower risk areas. But I always like to put the most emphasis on the US elements because that's where the OFAC risk really is, like we talked. So the example here, if you have a customer and they're exporting petroleum products to Syria and they pay for that in USD, that's pretty high risk. But if it's just a domestic company buying toys from a factory and paying for those in local currency, that's fairly low risk. And so we wouldn't need to put as much emphasis on that particular activity. Another thing I was asked about was contracts and letters of credit. Now, the rule here is pretty simple. OFAC really doesn't care very much about the contract. They care about the activity. If it's a violation, it's a violation. OFAC isn't really going to look at your contract to get you out of trouble. So the first thing I tell you is that OFAC regulations do not specify appropriate contract provisions. So there's no regulation that says you need to have contract provisions, and there's no regulation telling you what to put in them. It is a commercial and a legal decision that is based on your risk tolerance. Now, most companies like to put sanctions provisions in their contracts. They do it for two reasons. One, they try to manage risk that way, but second, they also want to evidence that they care about OFAC sanctions. They want to put their counterparties on notice that this is an important issue. And so you often see representations. The representations usually cover being a sanctioned party or beneficial owners, employees, affiliates, and making sure that they're not. They also usually include compliance undertakings, so you promise not to violate sanctions in relation to your contract. And they also include a use of proceeds if we talk about financial transactions. What that means is that if you have a transaction that generates money, it could be a loan or capital markets transaction, there might be restrictions on how the money is used so that it lowers the sanctions risk. So if the question is, can we remove language from a letter of credit related to sanctions? The answer is it depends on the transaction. What banks will usually do is they analyze the transaction to see what the sanctions risk is. If it's a low-risk transaction, they might be comfortable with removing the sanctions language. If it's a high-risk transaction, especially if it involves the US financial system, now there's a couple of recent examples, enforcement cases, where OFAC talks about contracts. I've put the names here. You can Google them and look them up. I won't go into detail in the interest of time. But in both of those cases, what happened was the companies had a template. They had a normal contract that they always used that had sanctions language in it. But for certain transactions, they would take the language out, and then they would allow activity to occur. And so in those cases, OFAC looked at the contracts and said, normally you have language, but in these examples you don't. And as a result, there was a sanctions violation. So again, they're focused on the activity, not the contract. But if you have a contract that you normally use, you should probably stick with it as much as possible. Now, the next two slides, I just want to provide some helpful resources. So these are things that you can bring up online on your computer at any time. The first is the OFAC search tool. Many of you are familiar with this, but I provided the link here. It's where I always go if I need to see if somebody's on the sanctions list or if I need to get more information about an SDN. So this is a great resource. But there's another one that people don't usually know about, and it's called export.gov. And this has something called the Consolidated Screening List. Again, I provided you the link, or you can Google this online. And what's nice about the Consolidated List is that it has several different US government lists in it. It's the Department of Commerce, Department of State, Department of Treasury. So several different lists. You can search them all at once. It has some fuzzy logic, and it also provides links back to the agency that has the list. So it's really convenient, easy to find, easy to use. So if you just need to do a quick desktop search and you're looking for US sanctions, this is a great resource. So I wanted to share that. I was also asked how people can stay up to date. And this is one of the trickiest part of sanctions because it changes so much. And many of you said earlier that one of the biggest challenges was that the rules are very complicated. So you need a good source of information. So here's some things that I recommend. The first is to go to the OFAC Resource Center and sign up for their mailing list, because then you're going to get OFAC notices the minute that they happen, when someone's added to the SDN list, when there's a new general license, when there's a new executive order that's been put into effect, et cetera, et cetera. It also includes settlements and penalties. So this is the #1 source of information. It comes directly from OFAC. At the bottom, though, I also use Google Alerts. So I put a Google alert for sanctions, and that gets me a lot of information on a daily basis that I can use to keep up to date. So that's one that's very helpful. Many law firms have blogs and advisories. I've shown you an example from my law firm, and these are also great sources of information. They're free. You can sign up, and you get an expert's opinion on important issues. And then finally, thanks to LinkedIn and other sites, there's many professionals who share information online. I could read if you'd like, but there's many other people that do as well who provide excellent information. So you can use that as a resource to keep yourself informed. But I think what's really important is that we remember that we all have access to a global network of practitioners, especially through groups like Fintellect and other organizations, and we should really take advantage of them to share knowledge to make sure that we're able to do our jobs well and protect our institutions. So I did want to share that with you, and these are the resources that I use in my own work. So that's a lot of information. We have about 10 minutes left, and so I think we're able to do a few questions, and then we'll have closing remarks. Is that right, Shirish and Arpita?
That's right, Rick.
Okay.
Maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions.
Great.
That's right. So I will, yep.
Now later on,
Arpita,
if there's
to,
oh, there you go. This is a great question. It says, if sanctions are imposed on an existing customer, what steps should be followed? Let's go back to the first part of the training and remember our building blocks. The first thing we need to think about is where the US elements are. If we have a customer who's on the SDN list, we have to cut off access to the US financial system immediately. So if you get a name screening alert on a customer account, you determine it's a true hit. Usually the first thing you do is you suspend the account so that they're not processing transactions through the US financial trade transactions or whatever the case may be. And then you can perform a review. You can decide if there's a secondary sanctions risk. You can decide if there's a local sanctions risk because it might be the UN sanctions list. Or you can decide if your business wants to exit the customer because of your own risk tolerance. But again, we always keep the difference between US person and non-US person in mind because you might have some flexibility. But you can always do it in a way which is compliant with OFAC regulations and which manages your other risks. So that's a great question, but you should have a process in place ahead of time, and you should know who your key stakeholders are, who your technology partners are, who can help you manage those accounts.
Right. What's the next one?
Oh, so the EU and US are growing apart on sanctions policy. What impact will that have on global sanctions compliance? Well, it's interesting. There was a case that just went to the EU Court of Justice where Bank Melli is in a dispute with Deutsche Telekom because Deutsche Telekom canceled some of their accounts. And they said, oh, well, that's a violation of the EU blocking regulation. And so they're fighting over that in court. And what the case points out, and what I think is true, is that it means that a lot of companies will have to make choices, and they're difficult choices because you have to choose between US law and you have to choose between local law, and you have to find the right balance. I think for Iran, this is going to be a really complicated issue, especially in the United Nations, because there's going to be a big fight over sanctions in the UN in the coming months. And so I think we have to watch it very carefully, but it's important to always try to keep that balance in mind and to balance as many risks as possible.
Right. Here's one from the audience.
Okay.
Sorry.
Are there any challenges to receive wage earner remittances from the listed countries? So I think the listed countries here include Crimea, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Now, there's two different ways of looking at this question. The first one is has to do with the nationals of those countries. So if you have a national of a sanctioned territory, let's use a Iranian passport holder as an example, and they live outside of Iran. So let's say they live in Bangladesh, or they live in Hong Kong, or they live in the United States. They're not subject to the Iranian sanctions because they're individuals, they're not SDNs, and they live outside of the sanctioned territory. So that's the first rule. The second rule is that with remittances, so personal remittances that are fairly small and they're used for personal expenses, there are usually general licenses for those. So you may be able to process those through the US financial system. If those transactions are not through the US financial system, if they're outside the US financial system, they're fairly low risk, frankly. OFAC doesn't put a lot of focus on individual remittances because the sanctions programs are meant to target the governments, not really to target the people. Are some industries and sectors exposed to greater sanctions risk than others? If so, which industry and sectors have greatest risk and how? Well, I included some on the slide about the Iran secondary sanctions. So that's one example that you can use. I want to say that when you look at the OFAC enforcement cases, actually there have been enforcement cases in almost any industry that you can think of. There have been healthcare settlements, energy settlements, telecommunications, banking, and even one against a flour company that sent flour seeds to Iran. So OFAC really looks very broadly at OFAC compliance. So we can't rule anything out. What we really need to focus on are the US elements, the US financial system, and those OFAC regulations. That being said, OFAC is very focused on financial institutions. They're very, very focused on shipping and the shipping sector. And they're increasingly focused on technology, especially digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. Those are the things that the US policymakers are talking a lot about. But as a general rule, we would try to look at all of the business equally when we talk about sanctions compliance.
Okay, I think we'll have time for one more.
Okay. What are the new sanction circumvention techniques and what are ways to detect them? This one is tricky. There are a few things that I think you should look for. First of all, look for intermediary countries like Dubai, Turkey, Singapore, Hong Kong, and other countries which are used as trading hubs There are many, many cases where there are front companies or intermediaries who are engaging in transactions that are actually related to sanctioned territories. And from OFAC's point of view, it doesn't matter if it's direct or indirect. Like in the example I showed you earlier, if we have a third party or a third country, but we know for a fact that the transaction relates to a sanctioned territory, it should not be processed through the US financial system. So I think that's one thing that we need to focus on. Second of all, I think there's an increasing use of digital transactions for sanctions evasion. And this includes not only things like cryptocurrency, but also VPNs and anything that can help mask the locations of people. And so you might have somebody with an account in Hong Kong who resides in a sanctioned territory, and they're able to access their bank account. This is tricky because there aren't very many good controls yet and good technology for detecting that, but there are some vendors who are working on it, so it's something that I would keep an eye on. If you have the ability to do internet protocol blocking for your online banking services, that can be really important, and that's something that OFAC does expect.
Well, thanks, Nick, for taking all those questions.
Yes,
I think.
Thank you very much. I just want to say to everybody again, Ramadan Kareem, and thank you for sharing some time with me today. And thank you to everyone who helped to organize today's session. Shirish, I know you have some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think it was an excellent session. Arpita, if you can switch back to the presentation slides, please. And I'd like to display the next one, which has Nick's contact details again. So participants, I would encourage you to write to Nick, contact him on email or phone in case any of your questions have not been answered. And I think he will do his best to answer it whenever he gets time. Maybe if there are too many, he will send a proposal to your bank or to ACOP for step 2 and also provide legal support services if you all think it would be beneficial. Let's move to the last part of the program today. I'd like to invite Mr. Sudhesh Chandra Das, ACOP Chairman, to deliver the vote of thanks. If you could switch to that.
For moving forward in the best interest